This is the Comics Alternative EuroComics, reviews of The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen and Prima. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative EuroComics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Edward. Hi, everyone.
Yes, and we're two guys with or almost with PhDs talking about EuroComics. And on the August episode, Edward and I are going to be talking about The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, written by Jorge Zentner with art by Rubén Pellejero. And then after that, we're going to be discussing Prima by Alfred. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative EuroComics is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off the cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover, but often you can find discounts that go higher from there.
Right. In fact, The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, one of the books we're discussing today, is now 35% off at dcbservice.com. And they've also got a terrific selection of other EuroComics, like I Am Legion with art by John Cassaday at 30% off, and a hardcover collection of heavy metal comics at 30% off as well.
That's right. You know, you can always find great discounts at DCB Service, and that includes European-based comics or comics in translation as well. So go to the website, dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Edward and Derek sent you. So, Edward, this is our second month of the EuroComics series, and we got a couple of really good titles to discuss this time around. And in fact, we should mention, in the way of a teaser, that over the past month or so, you and I have been talking about other possible titles that we want to put on the to-discuss list for the rest of the year. So there's a lot of excitement for our listeners to look forward to.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff coming down the pipeline, and there's also a wealth of older stuff we'd like to bring to readers' attention.
You know, that's a good point. I think when you and I first came up with the idea of the monthly EuroComics series, we kind of assumed that at least maybe half of the things that we discussed would be older publications. But then once we started to look into all the new translations that were available in the coming months, it dawned on us, you know, we could just discuss new releases or new-ish releases, let's say new translations, and we'd still have plenty to discuss.
Absolutely. It's really, the EuroComics scene is really blowing up these days. There's a lot of publishers doing terrific work.
Well, you know, you're in the business, right? Because you're a translator, and you have a much better sense of what's going on with European comics, or at least non-Asian foreign language translations, than I do. So, I mean, do you think that over the past few years there has been a significant increase in the number of translated comics?
I do. I think, there was the first sort of mini boom was in the mid-2000s, and then there was a kind of a slump around, say, 2009 to 11, and then really I think the scene has really diversified since then. And so I think the mid-2000s boom was due to major publishers trying to replicate the success of Persepolis and picking up comics, but then the post-aughts boom has really been lots of tiny indie publishers picking up French comics, and they each have their own aesthetic, and they're pursuing very different kinds of books, which just means, more EuroComics for readers, and also more different kinds of EuroComics for readers. Both of those are good things.
Yeah. So what do you think is behind the most recent increase in publications of comics in translation?
I really think it's sort of smaller presses or imprints, and the variety of them, the variety of their tastes, and the sheer number of them picking up.
Okay. That's interesting. Well, let's go ahead and get into this month's discussion, and we're going to begin with a recent publication, The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen. This is written by Jorge Zentner, and the art is by Rubén Pellejero.
That's right.
And this is being published through IDW's EuroComic imprint, and Dean Mullaney is the editor behind that. In fact, last year we spoke with Dean on the podcast, and he was telling us about some of the big plans he had lined up for the EuroComic series. And they first got off the ground, the IDW EuroComic series, with the Corto Maltese books that they're still in the process of releasing. But there are others in the pipeline as well, and the Adventures of Dieter Lumpen is just another of the ones that they have done. So had you read anything from Zentner before?
I had not read stuff from Zentner before. I had read books that Pellejero did with other writers. He and Zentner were a really close and prolific collaborative team for a long time. And the two of them pretty much broke out together. But then since then, Pellejero, has become such a art star that he's worked with several other prominent writers. And I had read some of the work he did with Denis Lapierre, who's one of the most prolific French comics writers. But I hadn't read any Zentner before. I do have to say, though, just touching on what you were saying before, Dieter Lumpen, like Corto Maltese, is primarily an old-fashioned adventure series, and Pellejero is now the new illustrator for the Corto Maltese series because its original creator Hugo Pratt is deceased. So he's definitely I see. The influence of Corto Maltese in Dieter Lumpen, tributes to it, homages to it, and also the fact that he's now picked up the torch. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now you mentioned Zentner and Pellejero as a really good creative team. Now I'm guessing from the introduction that the volume that you and I are discussing are all of the Dieter Lumpen stories that they did together. Correct?
Yes, and it covers like a 10-year period, I believe. 9 or 10-year period.
Yeah, and what we have in this collection basically is 11 stories, the first 8 of which are shorter pieces, and those originally appeared between 1985 and 1986. And then the last 3 stories in this collection, Enemies in Common, Caribbean, and The Reaper's Price, are longer, and they were published respectively in 1987, 88 and 89, and then the last one, The Reaper's Price, 1994. Yes. So you're right, it covers about almost a 10-year period.
Yeah, and I do want to note that, both the books we're discussing today were Zentner and Pellejero together won the top prize at Angoulême one year, and Alfred did as well. Zentner and Pellejero didn't win for Dieter Lumpen, but Alfred did for the book that we'll be discussing, Come Prima. And also, both books are prefaced by prominent American creators, which I find, is terrific. Really, it helps give them some notice and context here. Dieter Lumpen is prefaced by Tim Sale,
Yeah, I thought that was impressive. And then, as we can mention again once we get to it with Como Prima, it's Jeff Smith.
Yeah, Jeff Bone Smith.
Yes, I guess it's not really an intro; it's more like a preface or just a few words. It doesn't even take up an entire page, but he basically sets the stage and welcomes the reader to the text. Tim Sale's piece is a little longer, but again, it's relatively on the short side. But that's okay, because what they're doing is they're pointing out a couple of things that they really like about these books that we're about to read. Now, as I mentioned, this is the first time that I have experienced the Dieter Lumpen stories. Had I not known that these were written in the 1980s and then that last piece, 1994, and I picked this up I would have thought that this was written in the post-World War II period, maybe around there, because it does have that kind of Franco-Belgian clean line look to it. And I would have thought, I just wasn't aware of this. I'm assuming that this was published in the last half of the 20th century. I mean, it was, but not that late in the 20th century.
Yeah, it certainly has that feel in the kinds of exotic locations it generally tends to choose. It definitely feels like a Raiders era or immediately post-war era, or even like, Bogan, Bacall, kind of like To Have and Have Not, or African Queen kind of stuff, So
yeah, definitely, but not just in terms of the theme or the setting or even the kind of story. This being an adventure travel narrative, but in the way that the story unfolds, the art, the panel layouts. I just would have thought that this is something from an older time, from decades before. And I think that that's interesting that Zentner and Pellejero are writing and illustrating in that manner.
Yeah, and I think Zentner also was a reporter before he started writing comics, and he's a journalism student and then a foreign correspondent. So he's also written fiction as well. So like. I do think, but it's interesting how that you mentioned Tintin and the grand classic tradition of francophone adventure, because I do think adventure is a genre that has a lot of representation, takes up a fair amount of shelf space in the pie chart of francophone BD.
Yeah, definitely of European comics. Not so much, though, when it comes to U.S.-produced comics, or at least not near as much as you would think. And so that's one of the reasons why I found all of these stories in this collection really refreshing.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that they don't just – there's a fair amount of range in them. They don't – I mean, you have your typical exotic settings, South America – India, Greece and the Mediterranean, North Africa, and then at the very end, the Caribbean and America. But you also have stories that are somewhat have some fantastical tinges to them. I wouldn't say nothing outright, but like definitely a kind of occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge kind of feel to one in particular, and like. Yeah, and then one that outrightly deals with a ghost. Yeah, so then they do dabble in different genres, because the other ones are strictly realistic, sort of hard-boiled war stories about gun running or treasure hunting.
Yeah, and as we're describing this to our listeners, I would bet you that most of them, when they hear the words adventure, South America, and exotic locales, Raiders of the Lost Ark immediately comes to mind. And that makes sense. But one of the things I really enjoyed and appreciated about the Dieter Lumpen stories is that they both do and don't resonate in that way. In other words, with Indiana Jones, I mean, this is almost a larger-than-life figure. Not a superhero, but the many feats that he undergoes through the various films. I mean, he does come across really heroic, right? Death-defying scenes, actions, and all of that. The thing I love about Dieter Lumpen is that the protagonist, Dieter Lumpen, is in many ways kind of an everyday guy, an everyman. He is not necessarily brave, and he points this out a few times. He's attractive enough to where he has various relationships, and he's attracted to the opposite sex, just like Indiana Jones is. But I think there the comparison tends to break down. He doesn't seek adventure. Dieter Lumpen doesn't. He doesn't go out of his way to get into any trouble. And in fact, with a story that I hope we spend some time talking about, one of the longer ones, Caribbean, I mean, he intentionally takes himself out of the, as we can call it, the adventure game, although adventure comes to seek him when he doesn't necessarily want it. So this is someone who is very unlike Indiana Jones, even though describing the adventures of Dieter Lumpen, one may think of Indiana Jones as a point of comparison.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, like, I do think, especially in the earlier pieces where they seem to be sort of locating his character a bit, he's definitely not heroic, or not heroic. It doesn't mean he's not capable of heroic acts, but he's not by instinct a hero in any way. And I think the moment I fell in love with him as a character was actually the second story, Games of Chance, because it's really quite mean. I mean, his behavior is he's a survivor. I mean, he's a drifter and a survivor.
Right.
And he is not above, he's not above killing people if it, just to save his own skin, or even just to keep a promise. He's not. He's what I was going to say about earlier is, like, when they're still kind of locating his character in these early stories, it does seem that, as you pointed out, he gets caught up in other people's adventures. He starts out as a very passive character, and then at some point in the story clicks into active mode, generally to save his skin.
Right.
Or to pay off a debt or something like that.
Exactly. And, speaking of debt, one of the things we see among the various stories, and, there are 8 shorter ones, 3 longer ones, and they're to greater or lesser degrees interconnected, especially those first short 8 pieces. He comes into money, he loses money, he's comfortable, he's destitute, and so there are definitely some ups and downs with Dieter Lumpen's life.
Yeah, I think I actually appreciate. I really do appreciate the earlier stories, because I find them narratively, just in terms of, in terms of panel to panel, they're narratively extremely concise and to the point, and have good twists to them. Not like big gotcha twists, just twists that I think are well balanced for the length of the story.
Yeah, exactly. And we should mention that all of these stories take place in, I guess, what we could call the immediate post-war World War II years in the 1940s. Now, let's talk a bit about those first 8 stories that you mentioned. I'm like you, I really appreciated what they did in terms of establishing his character in a variety of different ways. Those 8 stories are A Dagger in Istanbul, the one that you mentioned a second ago, Games of Chance, Time Bomb, His Master's Voice, A Question of Skin, The Bad Guy, Cupid's Sin, and Goldmouth. They're great titles in and of themselves, but I think each one of them tells us, well, each one of the stories takes place in a different part of the world where Lumpen is in a different situation, and many times I think with all 8 of these stories, when one begins, we get him where he is when the previous story ended. And so Zentner is really good in these first 8 stories, picking up where he left off.
Absolutely. And I know that last week you mentioned how, short story cycles are some of your favorite structures, whether in prose or comics. I was wondering if you thought this, qualified as one.
That's interesting. I think that if we look at just the first 8 stories, the last 3 are longer ones. Maybe we can set those out as something a little different. They were created, I guess, around the same time. I don't know if they were intended to work together. I think it's the intention of working together that would be a big thing with me. If they're just 8 stories that have something in common, same character, same setting, one picking up where the other one leaves off, and they were published separately with no intention, at least overt intention, of bringing them together. In other words, they weren't created as a cohesive whole. I wouldn't call it a short story cycle, but when you get these 8 individual stories, put them together, then they read very much like a cycle narrative.
Yeah, I mean, my personal favorites are generally the ones that show Lumpen to be that show Lumpen's anti-heroic qualities, just because they tend to have a little more bite to them for me at the end.
Like Games of Chance.
Games of Chance, and also, but the bad guy, the bad guy. But I also quite enjoyed Goldmouth, which really is not his story so much as it's a story of it's someone else's story that he's there to witness. And I personally, I think the weaker ones are the weakest one for me was the ghost story set in, oddly enough, in France.
Cupid's Sin.
Yeah, I think that was just. I mean, maybe it just came off a little worse because compared to last month's extremely strong showing in the same vein, it just felt a little like a fainter version, of like it couldn't compare to, say, Adam Sarlik, right? Like that, which we discussed last month. But I also think the question of skin is maybe not the book's most incisive treatment of an exotic locale. I think, or exotic characters, exoticism. I think it's a little standard feeling to me. Whereas I think the Caribbean actually pulls off an exotic character much better, I think.
Right. Now, A Question of Sin takes place in India. And this is around the time of the British Empire. Their hold on India is weakening, and we even get images, at least one image of Gandhi in this story. The thing about A Question of Sin that bothered me was not so much the locale as it was the moral heavy-handedness that went into this story. I don't think anyone would read this and quibble with, where Zentner was going here.
No, it's just well, that's what I meant by standard, I guess. It's a little pat as a conclusion, and it doesn't really show you anything new about the characters or the situation. Right.
So it's for those reasons. I mean, I like the story well enough, but like you, it wasn't one of my favorite of those first 8 especially. The ghost story, Cupid's Sin, I thought was okay. I guess I thought that was more cute than anything, and not just because it had the word Cupid in the title. But it being a ghost story, it definitely stood out among all the stories in this collection. I guess the one that would be closest to it is one of the longer ones at the end, Caribbean, and we'll get to that. There's something, I guess you could call a little supernatural about that story, but it's much more subtle. But in Cupid's Sin, we have an outright ghost story.
Yeah, I mean, Caribbean, I do think, has supernatural, like a hint of supernatural elements, and also the last story does as well. I think the last story is the one I thought of as an occurrence at Owl Creek kind of setup, where and because there's a lot of overt references to, the fates and like a guy named Reaper driving around a hearse.
I definitely want to get to Reaper's Price, that last story of this book. But getting back to the first 8 stories, is there one of those that really stands out to you? I mean, is it Games of Chance?
I think Games of Chance surprised me and hooked me, and then I think my next favorite would be Goldmouth.
Yeah, and now see, Goldmouth does take place in. Let me see. I'm trying to get there now. It begins in. God, where is this? Where do we start? In Paris.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he is with a woman named Magda, and there are various women who are a part of his story throughout this collection. And Magda is the one who he meets in Paris, and Magda had a grandmother, right?
Right.
Who was a famous opera star in, where was it in Brazil? It's in Brazil. It's not on the coast.
It's in Manaus.
Manaus. So they go there because Magda's grandmother had a lover who was Brazilian, very dark skin, and because he was dark skinned, was beat up for that, and his mouth was busted. And of course, the grandmother had a lot of money; she was a famous opera star, and so she made sure that the dentist put really nice new teeth in. Thus, the name Goldmouth. And so, when Magda learns that Goldmouth may still be alive, her grandmother is now long dead, she wants to seek him out. It's like the last connection she has to her grandmother. And so Lumpen goes with her, and the most of the story takes place during this trip and them actually getting to meet Goldmouth.
Yeah, they have a little, trip beset by minor dangers up the Amazon. and they come to meet Goldmouth.
Yeah. And, it's interesting talking, kind of recounting what goes on in Goldmouth, in that for it to be such a short story, as all of the first 8 are, there's a lot packed into it, action-wise. And so I think that's one of the things that really impressed me about the stories in the Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, especially the first 8, is that even though they're shorter pieces, no longer than, about 8-10 pages, there's a lot that takes place in those stories. And I think that Zentner and Pellejero do a great job of condensing the action, but in ways that don't short shrift the adventure.
No, absolutely. I mean, I would say that that was what I was alluding to earlier with the comment about concision. I do think that they, almost as it almost seems to be the exception that panels follow each other. That like consecutive panels will be from the same scene. Like it's usually that they do a lot. I think they manage a lot of this, a lot of their narrative concision by skipping large amounts of time between scenes, and also even in the later stories, the longer stories, they keep a lot of the dialogue interesting by having dialogue play out over scenes where you don't see the people talking. So that's another way of sort of collapsing time. The people are talking, but something else is happening, something else that might actually be in the future or in a different time, or is kind of a montage, or and I think both of those are some of the tools they use to really to cover vast amounts of information
information,
story.
Action, and territory.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I really didn't notice a difference in storytelling technique in terms of condensing information, the way that they lay out the action, the dialogue. I didn't notice a difference between, let's say, the first 8 short stories and then the 3 longer ones at the end. I mean, to me, it just seemed the same kind of storytelling, the same kind of successful storytelling, but with longer stories.
Yeah, I think they do let a few more scenes play out in the longer pieces, and I think the thing I noticed in the later stories wasn't so much a storytelling difference as well, there's 2 things. I do think when I say their dialogue plays out over different stuff in the later stories, I think I just noticed that because in the early stories there's a lot more narration. It's narration that plays out over sequences, and then in the later stories you get more dialogue that plays out over sequences. But also that the faces, it's like it becomes more comfortable. So the faces actually, for me, became a little more cartoony, not in a bad way, just in an objective way, in the later work than in the earlier one. I'm thinking particularly of the commander who flies the hot air balloon.
Oh, Enemies in Common.
Yeah, in Enemies in Common. Chino in the Caribbean. These are like somewhat more cartoony faces.
Well, they're definitely distinctive faces.
Yeah, I mean the commander, the balloon flying commander, really for me evokes Tardy a lot. Jacques Tardy. It's a very Tardy face for me. And then almost everything about the final story, The Reaper's Price, for me that's a story that's stuffed with Corto Maltese allusions, just as the Caribbean, features a Carlos Gardel character, which is, a tribute not only to a character that many Argentine comics artists actually have. Since he's such a Franco-Argentine figure, many Argentine comics artists who and creators who made who became successful in France have covered parts of his story in some way.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk a bit about those longer stories toward the end, and these are Enemies in Common, Caribbean, and The Reaper's Price. Now, Enemies in Common is the one that you had mentioned with the hot air balloon pilot. That takes place in Tunisia. Caribbean, understandably, takes place in the Caribbeans. And then The Reaper's Price takes place in the United States. Although I don't know, if we're told exactly where in the U.S. most of the seeming action, and we say seeming action for a reason, seems to take place, but it does seem like the Southwest.
Yeah, it absolutely looks like the U.S. of movie westerns.
Right.
And
it has a Texas flavor to it.
And there's significant action also, but it's flashback action in China and Venice.
Right. And yeah, I want to spend quite a bit of time talking about Reaper's Price, because I feel that if I had to pick my favorite of this entire book, not just the longer stories, I would have to say that it's Reaper's Price, because I felt that it was the most ambitious of all of them. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about, we can talk about Enemies in Common, but I found Caribbean rather curious because of that aforementioned supernatural element.
Yeah, so do you want, basically for me, that supernatural element revolves around a character named Chino, right, who's kind of just a really big guy.
Who works on a fishing boat with Dieter.
Who works on a fishing boat. Yeah. And he doesn't say much, but he seems to have the ability to affect events around him, whether they be as small as, like the trajectory of a billiard ball, or as large as, a plane engine malfunctioning.
Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, this guy seems to have some kind of power of telekinesis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and when we are first introduced to this, and I'm looking at, it's on page 150, Dieter and Chino are playing a game of pool, and Dieter is shooting, they're making a shot, but the ball doesn't hit what, in terms of physics, it should hit. It moves around it. And when Dieter notices that, there's this big question mark and exclamation mark coming from his head. And I was the same way. Before I knew what was going on, I thought, what the hell just happened here? And there's no clue that Chino's the reason for this happening. But then as the story unfolds, we start to see that, Chino is not just this affable guy, and that's all there is. This big affable guy, and that's all there is to him. I mean, he has some kind of power because he's when he attends to something, he can change its movement or change what happens with it. And as you pointed out, it could be something small like a cue ball, or it could be something big like the engine of a plane.
Yeah, I think Chino, for me, is one of the more successful exotic characters, in so much as you have a trope of a white guy coming to an exotic place and then realizing that the natives have some spiritual power of some sort, or some other moral system based on this spiritual power. I feel like it's more effective with Chino than with the sort of Dieter's appreciation or lack thereof of Indian mysticism in the earlier piece. Mainly because I think Chino is more fleshed out as a character, and this longer piece does a lot, I think, for fleshing out Dieter's character too, because it leads him into a lot of self-questioning and about his motives and what he wants out of life. Because I think the plot engine of the piece is that a Hollywood producer shooting a movie on the island where Dieter is making a lazy living as a fisherman. Offers to make Dieter a star, and Dieter doesn't really. Dieter's both tempted and
repulsed by the possibility. Yeah. And so there's a lot of soul searching on Dieter's part, but the storytellers do a good job of projecting that outward onto events. He seems to do so through events like fishing, fighting, but also going on this long midnight trip with Chino to a mysterious island where they meet someone who should be dead. Oh, that's right. Oh, the guy with the mask.
Yes.
And he was a movie star at one point.
He's Carlos Gardel, the Franco-Argentine singer, songwriter, and actor.
Yeah.
that we were referencing earlier. A wholly fictional version of Gardel.
Yeah. Okay, now let me ask you about something that you said. You said that, again, regarding Chino in the story Caribbean, that you saw him as maybe an example of what Zentner was thinking about in terms of maybe an exotic other?
Yeah, to some extent. Yeah, because, he's stoic, silent, magical, yeah, and has a different set of values in life from the main character and from other more Western characters in
the reason I'm asking you about that, I found it interesting in that I didn't have that impression when I read this story, but then when she said it, I started to think, is this where Zentner was going here? I don't know if I'm convinced if that's the case, and I'll tell you why. If there was something about Chino's supernatural power, his telekinesis, if we want to call it that, that was linked to the culture, something supernatural and unknown, exotic and mysterious about Caribbean cultures, then yeah, I would definitely agree with you there. But it's not. I mean, in fact, Chino is a character that seems to me almost completely divorced from his surroundings. In other words, we could get a character very much like Chino in almost any other place where Dieter Lumpen ends up in this collection. At least that's my impression. So, in other words, I don't think that there's anything inherently Caribbean about the character of Chino. I mean, he could be a Frenchman, right? And that Dieter meets in Goldmouth, but and still have the same powers, and I'd still probably feel the same way about him. In other words, I never got the impression that Zentner was exoticizing either Chino or Caribbean culture through Chino.
No, I think that's fair. I guess for me, the reason Chino seemed more representative of the islands maybe is because I see him through Lumpen's lens. Because for Dieter, Chino is someone who represents the island lifestyle that very much tempts him. And Chino knows a lot of secrets about the islands, right? Like he knows where to find. He knows special haunts. He knows where to find this secret island where Gardel lives. And it's true that Chino's ethnic background is never discussed in any way. But I do think, and so it's true that like he's a transplantable magic character. But I do think of him as tied to the way of life of the islands in the way that Dieter is not.
Okay, now that's a good point. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that because Dieter does seem to invest in the character Chino some kind of knowledge that he can rely on when his back is up against the wall. So, for instance, when he has to make this decision whether to become a movie star and move to America, he takes this to Chino and says, "Chino, what do you think? What should I do?" And so it's almost as if the Dieter is relying on his experience with the Caribbean, right, where he's located at that moment, in order to help guide him on his next possible adventure. So that makes sense. Yeah.
I see him as I don't necessarily see him as ethnically representative of the environment. There's no evidence of that. I just see him as sort of magically tied to the environment, or representative. Not ethnically representative, just representative somehow of the environment.
Right. And he's also one of the eccentrics in this story. And there are several. And I would include some of the Americans in there as well. They seem, in fact, a couple seem almost like stereotypes. Now, another eccentric in the story Caribbean is the barkeep. And what is his name? He's the one who has the treasure map tattooed on his private parts.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know, it was a moment. What is that bartender's name? I can't remember. I know that he refers to
Cusinio.
Cusinio? Okay.
Cusinio, yeah.
And he keeps referring to Iglesias, someone that he's speaking to, who seems to be an imaginary figure. Again, one of the reasons why people think that he is not all there. And in fact, that scene where he does whip out his map, so to speak, when he's showing the filmmaker, Mr. Ornak, and his assistant, Miss Verton, he goes on this fishing trip. He convinces, to set a context, he convinces Dieter who is taking Ornak on a fishing trip to take him along because he wants to get money for a treasure hunt expedition, and he has a map tattooed on his penis. So while they're out at sea, this bartender is talking to Ornak about the treasure map, and Ornak seems to be bothered by it, and he just says, well, why don't you show me the map, and then, I can make a decision. And he unzips his pants, and he shows it, and of course his Ornak's attractive assistant, Verton, is there, and the expression on her face when he whips it out, I don't know. I mean, I think that's a moment of levity, obviously, but it seemed a little bit out of place given the tone of other parts of the story and even the entire collection. Well, what did you think? I mean, I let me just say, I'm not a Puritan. I'm not saying that was inappropriate. I thought it was funny. I kind of liked it. It just seemed a little different from everything else that went on in this book. Yeah,
I mean, I guess I didn't really blink at it just because it's true that in terms of color, it's a little outside the. Now that you mention it, it's definitely a little outside the general what's been generally set up. But I guess I sort of overlooked it because that his story kind of fizzles out on the whole, so it doesn't really get picked up on later in the later in Caribbean.
Yeah. Now, another one of the longer stories, Enemies in Common. We've talked about this a bit. This is one that's actually kind of an involved story, and it lasted longer than I thought it would. I think it's a really good story, though. What are your thoughts about Enemies in Common?
It was my least favorite of the longer stories. I do think I felt like it was going in circles a little in the middle for me. It's basically, for me, it's about the friendship or Dieter's realization of his friendly feelings toward this sort of quixotic balloon flying
Commodore, yeah.
Commodore, and so I suppose I feel it sustains its length a little less well than the other longer ones.
Yeah, I liked it, but I think of the three longer stories, it's the most sentimental. And not just in terms of the ending. I mean, that's definitely there. But I think that the Commodore's love for his balloon. Oh, what does he call his balloon?
Vesuvius.
Vesuvius, that's right. His love for Vesuvius is, let's just say, obvious. Because he keeps talking about it over and over again. And I can understand someone being wedded to his, not just occupation, but this is his life. And I have nothing against that kind of sentimentality, but if I had to pick of these three longer stories, the one that I liked least, I'm with you on Enemies in Common. Again, a good story, historically based. I really like that it taps into what was going on in Tunisia at the time. But for me, the much more exciting story of this entire collection is the last one, The Reaper's Price.
Yeah. Just as a note, do you find if I said enemies in common and I said common enemies, would there be any difference between those phrases for you at all?
I don't know. Off the top of my head, no. Why? As a translator, are you thinking that it could have been condensed?
I guess so. I mean, condensation is not always going to be your number one. Your number one priority. But I mean, the French. See, here's the thing: is so we didn't mention the translator who it's credited to.
Oh yes, we should do that.
Carlos Guzman and Dean Mullaney, and what I'm not sure of is okay. So we have two creators who a writer and an artist whose primary languages are who both have Spanish as a native language. So it's quite possible that even though they were first published in French by a French company, it's quite likely that their working script and correspondence, etc., all these were in Spanish, and that it was just kind of translated into French at the last moment with their help for French publication. I mean, that was, for instance, the case with Black Sad. two Spanish language creators. They had worked in France at Disney France Animation Studios, but when they published their books, the Francophone publishing establishment for comics is just that much more powerful and well-paying. So they go, and so when a book comes out, it's first published in French. But it's quite possible that there's a Spanish language script somewhere. So what I don't know about Dieter Lumpen is whether it was translated from that Spanish script and then given a polish by Mr. Mullaney. And what makes me think that's a possibility is not only the vast assumption off the name vast unfounded assumption off the name Carlos Guzman, but also because I know that for Corto Maltese, what they did was work from original Italian scripts with an Italian translator instead of working from the French books, or they triangulated with the French books. So I'm not maybe the best person to judge especially to second guess what the original language was throughout Dieter Lumpen. But I do have to say that I feel like it's funny. Both the books that we're discussing this week, I don't think they're such terrific translations. Though Dieter Lumpen definitely edges out the translation for Come Prima. And I wish I didn't want to go through and nitpick, because every time you do, it's really counterproductive, and it's basically it basically comes down to it's not a pretty sight. I don't like translation reviews that do that either. But to segue to the Reaper's Price, let's just look at, there's a bit of dialogue on like the fourth or fifth page where Dieter says, "Shit." He's standing by the side of the road. He's been hitchhiking unsuccessfully, and he says, "Shit, now all I need is for the rain to start." There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's flawless English, right? But except that it's not what people say, right? They say, "Shit, now all I need is for it to start raining." Like, there's almost no difference there's zero difference in meaning between those. There's almost no difference in structure even. But one, to me, sounds a lot more natural. And I feel like my main beef with the translation throughout Dieter Lumpen is that there are places where, I'm sure there are like typos and weird things like that too, but there are just places where they really could have strayed farther from whatever the original was. I think my litmus test for this is always like, if you pick something that sounds better in English, what are you losing, really? What are you losing? And in many cases, I feel like there was an English alternative that had zero loss from the less smooth-sounding version we're given.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you're going to be attuned to things like that more than I am in reading this, because I didn't even think about for instance, the example that you gave on page 196 when it starts to rain and Lupin says, "Shit, now all I need is for the rain to start." Because I don't think in terms of a translator like you do. I mean, you have to grapple with that stuff all the time. That's your business. Yeah.
But, yeah, whenever, like I said, whenever you get into a translation discussion like this, they're always going to sound like nitpicks. But I do believe that it's the sort of sum of the nitpicks that can, as a whole, kind of warp your reading experience a little. And there were times where I felt like, it was a little sludgier than it needed to be, especially for an adventure story. I think a lot of what should shape your tone, you should never settle for, that's what the original says. I think what you can use to shape your tone is knowing what kind of story it is and and how that kind of story should sound in English. And there's a lot of times when Dieter sounds like he's speaking a little tonelessly, because he doesn't sound like the man of the world that he obviously is. He's speaking a little formally, a little stiltedly, a little tonelessly, because it's just a translation. It's not. It's not. There's and you could massage that little to give him a little more character. Something like that. These are that's the kind of level of things I'm talking about. I mean, I really don't think there's many flat out mistakes in this book. It's just. Yeah.
Well, okay. Outside of the translation issue, what did you think of the story, The Reaper's Price?
I really enjoyed the Reaper's Price, and like I said, I do think with the Venice angle and the China angle, it's the homage story to Corto Maltese. And structurally, I mean, I guess it's kind of spoilery to say, but I do think of it structurally as kind of an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the spoiler aspect of our discussion, because maybe when it comes to the ending of this story, we should just leave it at it has an occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge feel to it, and then because that doesn't really say explain what happens, but it sets a tone in a way. But I think that's okay. I don't think it's spoiling anything. We definitely don't want to give anything away of what happens at the very end. So I guess we have to be careful about that. The thing, though, that I really appreciate about The Reaper's Price is the way that things are structured. Now, part of the structure has everything to do with what I just mentioned, right? The occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge ending. So I don't want to go into too much detail there. But I will say, I am able to say that a thing I like about Reaper's Price is this story within a story within a story aspect. For instance, we begin somewhere in the American Southwest. We don't know where. It could be Texas. It could be New Mexico. Who knows? It seems like Texas to me. And he's on the side of the road. Dieter is. We don't know why. He's waiting for something or someone. We don't know what or whom. And it starts to rain. A car comes by, and he wants a ride. And the guy who eventually stops, is the titular character, someone who goes by the name of Reaper, and he's called Reaper because he drives a hearse. And in fact, there is a casket in the back of the hearse when Dieter gets in. And one of the funny and kind of creepy things at one point, when Dieter, I think he's getting out when they stop at the Three Sisters diner, he looks in the back, and on top of the coffin are the initials DL. And he thinks to himself, that's weird. That's strange. And then he goes into the diner. And then the diner is this almost surreal territory, right?
Yeah. It's very lurid. Very, very, the color scheme is extremely lurid.
Right.
And the lines suddenly become a lot less crisp.
Exactly, but I think the visuals relay much of that. But even outside of the visuals, the action and the logic that takes place inside of the diner seems to be surrealistic, because he ends up meeting this very attractive
blonde
waitress. Yeah, a lot of the women in Dieter Lumpen's life are blonde. But what is her name? I'm trying to
Lilith.
Lilith. Oh yeah, okay. As if that name shouldn't tell us something.
Yeah.
But he meets Lilith, and at first it seems as if Lilith is attracted to him. She sits with him. She talks with him. But then, as the conversation evolves, actually it doesn't evolve. It just happens rather quickly. She asks for this, outrageous price for the pie and coffee, and things seem to take a strange, unlogical turn from there. And so that's part of the surrealism, right? Where her attitude shifts in such a way that it seems that he's not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, and when he comes out of the diner, he can't find the car at first, and also the Three Sisters are obviously there's obvious allusions to the three the three fates. They're playing with yarn, snipping string, or even the Norns. The Three Sisters of many mythologies who supervise the lives of humans. Yeah.
Now you had mentioned the color and the shading in this story, especially inside of the Three Sisters diner. I'm looking specifically at pages 210 and 211, and tell me if you had the same experience. I looked at the illustrations of especially Lilith, and immediately I thought of Frank Miller and Sin City.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we might be going on this route where Munoz and Sampaio, they're a fellow Argentinian comic creators who are an avowed influence on Miller's Sin City, and have a similar style there. I do think this So there's a little circuit of influence going on, of quotation and influence. I think it's funny also that on that same page there's a really good illustration of a grumpy cat, 15 years before it became
the phenomena of grumpy cat. Yeah.
Yeah, but I do think this last story as a whole, not only is it the longest, but it's really a showcase. We haven't talked much about Pellejero's art, but it's really a showcase for his art, because there are so many locations, and he nails every single so many locations, so many moods, and those and so many like shifting realities, and he really does nail them. It's a chance for him to really spread his wings. Now that both creators are very comfortable with the character, and one of the things I admired about this story is that it does afford some closure to a character that feels like to me like he could go on indefinitely forever as the anti-hero of a serial, but this it's interesting that they actually brought their time with the character to an open-ended but nevertheless the bit of a conclusion, instead of just sort of like these because he's the kind of character whose adventure, like I said, his adventures could go on forever. But so yeah.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I would say that this is a very loose tie-up, but it did have a feeling of tie-up nonetheless. Now, getting back to what I was mentioning earlier, the stories within a story. Again, the context here is this guy who drives the hearse, the Reaper, picks up Dieter on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, and at first he won't let Dieter into his hearse unless he has something to pay. He says, you're going to help pay for the trip, pay for gas. And Dieter doesn't have anything for some weird reason. We don't know exactly why. And so the guy attempts to drive off, but then he, thinks again, stops, and says, okay, you can pay me in a different way. These are long stretches of road. It gets lonely and boring. So if I take you into town, tell me stories, talk to me, be my companion here. And so he encourages Dieter Lumpen to tell him stories about his own life. And of course, the stories that he tells about his life are the same kind of things that we've been reading about, especially in those earlier 8 stories of this collection, right?
Absolutely.
So the individual stories that Lumpen is telling could have been taken out and made into their own short stories. But the gist of each of the stories that he tells, and you can argue that they're both one longer story, but they deal with 2 different women in his life. One is a woman by the name of Mara, and he ends up meeting her. Where does he meet her? Is it in
New York, I think.
New York?
Yeah.
And then he meets someone, I think also in New York, right, named Mullaney?
No. What happens is he meets Mara in New York, where she's pretending to be a Salvation Army Santa, but she's really sort of being a courier for the mob money or some kind of crime money. But then she dumps him in Venice, and that's
it's Venice. Okay, see,
she dumps him in Venice. Yeah,
that's what I forgot. Yeah, it's the Venice is the link between the end of his relationship with Mara and the beginning of his relationship with Mullaney. And Mullaney is from China, and she has a twin sister there. But Dieter and Mullaney hit it off, and so half of his story to the Reaper is about his experiences with Mara, and then the other half is about his experiences with Mullaney, but not necessarily in chronological order, because he does kind of mix things up a bit as he's telling the story, as any one of us would do in telling our own stories. And so I really like that element to this longer story as well. But all of this is set within the context of this broader storyline, which is Dieter lost on the side of the road, being picked up by the Reaper and telling stories in order to earn his way, into the hearse. But you could even say, and rightly so, that there is an even more primary story underlying this one that we don't want to get too much into, because then we will be getting into spoiler territory.
Yeah, but one of the things that is difficult to pull off on a story like this is because characters are sometimes the faces of people in real life are also grafted onto other people in Dieter's imagination. The artist has to do Pellejero has to do a really careful job with delineating these faces and making them recognizable in different contexts, different outfits, on different in different situations, and that's one thing that he pulls off amazingly well.
Right. And we should mention, again, without giving anything away about the ending of this story, that characters' faces become of the utmost importance at the tail end of the story.
Absolutely.
and our abilities to recognize them because of what happens. So, and again, there's a lot that, I'm just chomping at the bit to say about this story and the reasons why I really love this. I think it's my favorite of the entire collection. But I can't because, again, it'll be giving something away. But the reason I do love this story is because we have examples of multiple levels of storytelling and embedded narratives within narratives within narratives. And that's one of the reasons why I think that of all of the stories, all of the 11 pieces in the Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, this is the most ambitious. And not only in terms of the storytelling, but in terms of Pellejero's art as well.
Yeah, I mean, Pellejero's art is pretty sumptuous all the way through this book. I mean, sure, it does change and deepen and develop, but it's even at the outset, it's pretty gorgeous. I mean, yeah, he's one of the greats, and it's good to have his stuff finally available here.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is something you should definitely pick up. The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen. This is part of IDW's EuroComics series. And in fact, I'm looking at the inside pages of this volume. This is only the third title that EuroComics has published. The first ones have been the Corto Maltese stories, right? So, the ones that they published so far together. And then the second one, which came out earlier this year, and in fact, Gwen and I discussed it on a regular review episode, Paracuelos by Carlos Jimenez. And then this one, Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, is the third. And we've got more to come from EuroComics and IDW.
Yeah, absolutely.
And more that we will discuss on this monthly series, I'm sure.
Yeah, and I think EuroComics is not the only imprint of IDW that'll be doing work in translation. I know that now that IDW has acquired Top Shelf will also be putting out, continuing to put out foreign language work.
Oh, yeah, and in fact, we've discussed one or two of those titles already on the show. Well, Edward, let's move on to the second title that we're going to be discussing this month, and that is Prima by Alfred. And Alfred is the pen name of Lionel Papagali.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now this is published by Delcourt, and one of one question I have for you, Edward, is, I guess, what's the context of Delcourt? I know it's a big French publisher. It's a publisher, though, that we don't hear much of here in the States, but they're starting to do more with translation and digital versions of translation, and you know about this, so explain.
Yeah, okay, so full disclosure, Delcourt is an employer of mine. But basically, there's in the French comics scene, in the Franco-Belgian comics scene, there's three major commercial publishers that dominate the market share the way Marvel and DC kind of do here. And that is Delcourt, Mediatune, which is mostly Dargaud, Dupuy, and Lombard, and Glénat. And those are the three. They have the biggest, the sort of biggest titles. They have the biggest stands at the Angoulême Festival, and they're the best sellers for mainstream Franco-Belgian comics. But of those three, Delcourt is by far the youngest. It's only started in the 80s, but it's made a really incredible name for itself. And so, quite recently, about a year ago now, Delcourt entered into a partnership with ComiXology, where they would release titles in translation, translated into English, because you can already get titles in French from Delcourt, from ComiXology, but now you can get certain titles also in English. And they commission these translations directly themselves. So usually I work for American publishers when I translate, or British publishers, but in this case I'm working for a French publisher. And they have a number of titles, both standalones or one-shots and series, available on ComiXology. Some of which I'd like to discuss. But Come Prima was one of the first books they put out there, and again, full disclosure, as soon as they first started talking to me about maybe translating for them, I was like, can I do Come Prima? And they're like, oh no, it's already been assigned to someone. I was like, darn it. So I really had I had heard about the book winning top prize at Angoulême in early 2014. I'd read it. I'd completely fallen in love with it. It's the first solo book by Alfred, first completely solo book. All his other books have either been collaborations with other writers or places where he's adapted existing novels and books. And I had liked Alfred's art from other shorter works I'd seen, and also his adaptation of Roland Topor's Cafe Panic. So it's this is one of the none of these books available at ComiXology are available in print in hard copy. They're only available in digital format.
And that's one of the things I find really interesting about this is that Delcourt is doing this with digital titles, the translations, but not with hard copy. And I'm wondering if they just sincerely feel that the money's not going to be there for them in hard copy.
I think that's true. I think Delcourt is not the only French publisher doing this. Glénat tried and released a couple of 3 different series on iTunes that I translated for them. And I'm one of several translators who works for Delcourt, and also one of several that works for Mediatune, which is Dargaud and Dupuis. Instead of going through ComiXology, Mediatune goes through their own site called EuroComics. And I do think it's a concerted effort on the part of the French majors to break into the American market and to do it in a way that is cost-effective for them, which is they're not sure if these books will find readers, or often they're not sure how to find readers from all the way over there. I don't think the ComiXology collection, the Delcourt ComiXology collection, is particularly well advertised here. I don't think that many people know about it, and it's a pity because they do some good books. But I think they're historically these are books that no U.S. publishers have picked up for some reason or another. They just haven't, and there are a lot of good books that happens to. There are tons of great books that will never get picked up or don't get picked up, or they're not new enough anymore for someone to pick up or anything like that. So the French publishers were like, okay, how can we do this how can we release them, make them available so at least readers might get more interest in them, and then but in a way that we can actually financially manage. And
right. And what you said about the Delcourt books on ComiXology and not knowing if that's the most effective way of finding potential readers, I mean, that's one of the big questions that I had, and that is, what is the likelihood of someone discovering these translated titles through digital means like ComiXology versus the likelihood that they would discover them in physical form, such as in a bookstore, right? I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, my feeling is that people, I don't know. I mean, I see downsides to both and also pluses to both. If they were going the hard copy route, in other words, doing the translations and making them available either only as hard copies or both hard copy and digital as well, it would seem to me that they would have to establish a relationship with a U.S.-based publisher, something like an imprint. In other words, what we have going on with IDW and Top Shelf, or IDW and EuroComics. And, I don't know why a publisher like IDW, or another one that would be a perfect fit for this as well, Dark Horse, if it was viable for them as well to get into this game and to establish a relationship with Delcourt and other French publishers of the like, I mean, that would be exciting. And I think that like the publishers like IDW and Dark Horse would have the wherewithal to publicize, get the word out about this stuff. And that's something that you don't get on ComiXology.
Yeah, no, I agree totally. I mean, it is one of my concerns about doing this this work. But I think, I mean, here's an upside. I think, or not an upside, but here's some counter things. For instance, I know that the Mediatune books on EuroComics, I know for a fact that the rights to the print rights to those are still available, because MediaToon does hold out hope that if enough people like the digital, they could still interest an American publisher in doing only the print. But see, that's their thinking. I don't know how attractive that is to an American publisher to only get print rights and not get digital rights, because digital rights have already happened. Like, it would have to be a really, really popular book. And I don't know if that's the case if Delcourt has a similar deal with ComiXology, especially since ComiXology is, owned by Amazon. I'm sure like that was a very difficult deal to push through. But what I do know is that the upside is that the sheer volume of books they're putting out is more than any single print publisher, English language print publisher would take on. I mean, I've done, upwards of 10 volumes in 2 different series just within the last year for Delcourt, ComiXology. So like we're talking about, you can get 10 58-page books from 2 different series on there, and that's a much. If you compare that to the pace of any of these smaller imprints that are doing French comics, and it's not something they could handle.
Right.
So yeah. So I mean, yeah. There's pluses and I do see from what I see that I'm not privy to editorial decisions, and I don't always approve of them, but I do see that Delcourt is. Come Prima was one of their first releases, and along with it, they did a couple other titles that like Come Prima, we'd consider indie comics. But then they quickly shifted away from that, and almost everything I'm doing for them now on ComiXology is definitely more genre. It's not superhero, since that genre isn't really that popular in France, but there's definitely there's science fiction. There's
right.
sort of like a Lost type mystery thriller stuff. There's sword and sorcery adventure, high fantasy stuff. That's actually one of the better series I'm doing for them now. Is a sword and sorcery.
Okay, so if our listeners, after hearing our, we hope, engaging conversation on Come Prima, that if they wanted to get a copy, they would go to ComiXology and they could find it easily enough.
Absolutely, I think it's like $6.
Yeah, so there you go. And, we should say that both you and I are, at least in terms of the English translation, I think you have a French hard copy, we're reading digital. And, that's going to have some challenges. I can't flip pages as quickly from a digital as I can on a hard copy. But let's start talking about the book proper. Now, you had mentioned that this had already been translated, meaning you didn't get to translate it. But I'm looking in the information at the front, and the translation is by Studio Charon. Is that correct? So it's a company.
Yeah, I have no idea what that means, but yes, I see that as well. Like, I don't know what it means to have a company. I've never seen that credit before.
Yeah, well, there you go. You were beat out by a company, my friend.
Yeah.
But but getting to the story of Come Prima, it's when you think about it, it's relatively simple and straightforward. There's not a lot going on in this story. At the very beginning, we're introduced to an Italian living in France. His name is Fabio, and he's a fighter. And he's maybe not the most successful fighter, but that's all a part of his larger personality, because he's not the most successful person, let's say, in getting along well with others. So he does have his problems. He does have relationships, but he does end up screwing up those relationships. He has some luck, mostly bad, it seems. But toward the beginning of the book, he is visited by his younger brother, Giovanni. Yeah. And Giovanni has come from home, from Italy, and has told him that
he's tracked him down. He had a hard time finding.
Yes,
because Fabio is estranged from his family.
Right.
Something happened years ago concerning his father, and he left.
And as the story continues, we get little bits of information about how that estrangement has taken place and some of the contexts and specifics about that. But Giovanni comes to him, says the father's died, and he has an urn with the father's ashes, we assume. And so Giovanni says, we need to go back home, put him to rest, take care of everything. And so reluctantly, Fabio gets in this little, looks like death trap Fiat of Giovanni's, which is part of his inheritance, as he points out. And they start driving back to Italy. Now, the adventure, we were talking about the Adventures of Dieter Lumpen as being adventure genre. I wouldn't call Come Prima adventure genre, but what they encounter are definitely various adventures, maybe on a smaller scale, on their trip, across the landscape from France into Italy.
Yeah,
So
I think it's definitely a road movie.
That's a good way of putting it, because basically what happens is not so much the outward adventures. I mean, there's some of that takes place, but it's the inward activity, the inward interaction and adventure that's so important, right? Which is the relationship between these two brothers that are estranged. It's them coming back together and also coming to grips with who they are to each other. So I think you see a little bit of that with Giovanni, but you definitely see this with Fabio, right? Him coming to understand himself better.
Yeah.
In a way that he couldn't before because of this road trip. So, in many ways, this is in a tradition that I think many of our listeners are well familiar with if they've read Huckleberry Finn. Right, the exterior journey is parallel to the much more important interior journey.
Yeah, and I think that I think there's definitely an attempt to. It's a very loosely structured book, and the art is loose too. I mean, Jeff. It's visually gorgeous throughout, but it's not. It never. I think Jeff Smith in his little preface points out that it's never afraid to experiment, and it's never afraid to suddenly become a very different kind of art. Alfred definitely switches styles sometimes from panel to panel. But the loose feel, the loose narrative feel, and the loose sort of artistic improvisatory feel, I think. Alfred has talked about some of his influences as sort of Italian movies from the 60s and 70s. Not necessarily things that a lot of people have seen over here, but you can kind of imagine, I guess, because there is a very European feel to the book as well. In the brothers' relationship, in the scenery, and so if we sort of transplant the American Southwestern, vast spaces road movie to to the French Italian kind of landscape, then we start to get a feel for the kind of book it is. I mean, I think the two main times in which the two main art styles operate in different time strata of time, right? You have the present day, more realistic, finer line style, and then you have these sequences of memory.
How would you describe the art in the memory section?
To me, you know what Alfred said he was going for was just something that almost looks screen printed, and I think that's not a bad way. It's like
that makes sense. Bold
primary colors, very faint outlines, large blocks of color.
Exactly, and one of the things we should point out that back and forth between the current present action, which is the road trip, right? The two brothers getting together, driving to Italy back home with the father's ashes, supposedly. That's the present, and those sections are interspersed with parts where you do have this screen print looking art with the primary colors. Another thing that is notable about it is these are memories for the past, and as such, there are certain panels or certain images that are a part of panels that are repeated again and again and again, sometimes with variation, sometimes without that variation. But we start to see a pattern, and the way that those screen print looking sections are presented is very much like memory. So it's as if Alfred was trying to do artistically to represent what the mind does, and that is come back to the same things over and over again. A repetition, but with variation.
Yeah, and I mean, Alfred has said that. I mean, it's always a danger to read too much onto the artist's biography, creator's biography. But Alfred has said that he definitely did draw on some personal memories for this book. You can tell from his real surname Papagalli that his family is an immigrant family from Italy, and he said before that these aren't just personal memories. Some of them set a very specific political context. Mussolini pops up in one of them at a rally, and he said that he feels that he couldn't address that directly on a historical level because he was several generations removed from that. It wasn't his experience, but he does feel like no Italian, his family, migrated to France after the war, but he does feel like like many Italian families, but he feels like there's no Italian family that can escape that, like that hangs over everyone, and so he definitely wanted to put that in the book. And he's also said that he was estranged from some of his brothers for a while, so that's made its way in as well. And the improvisatory nature at first, because it was his first solo book, he really wanted a tight script, and he wrote one out, very detailed tight script for himself, and then realized he couldn't follow it at all. That in order to get out to express what he wanted to express in the book, he had to go completely off his own script. And I think that's what lends some of the book. I guess what I feel is that even though the book has a very loose narrative, it's extremely emotionally powerful.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you were mentioning something about the time frame here. It's interesting in that the events that take place in Come Prima are roughly the same time setting of the stories and adventures of Dieter Lumpen. With Dieter Lumpen, they're in the later 1940s. In Come Prima, we're in the 1950s. And in fact, I think at one point they're listening to a radio and they mentioned the year 1958.
Yeah.
And so the events that are taking place, the brothers taking this road trip, takes place in 1958. But the memories are taking place in the decade or so previous to that. Because one of the things that estranged Fabio from not only his brother Giovanni, but more importantly his father and others from home, is that he became a black shirt.
Yeah.
And that caused friction within his community. But we find out that, Fabio isn't so much, he doesn't really necessarily have a longing for fascism, right? He just wanted to get away. And by donning the black shirt uniform, becoming a black shirt, that was one attempt for him to try to get away. And another one, as we learn later, is him joining the Italian army to fight in Africa. And so that was another big breaking point I think that was the main breaking point between him and his father. And so, Alfred uses Italy's fascist past during, the 1930s into the 1940s as a way of setting the stage for Fabio and his relationship with his father and his brother Giovanni. But Fabio doesn't come across as a fascist character. He just played into what was going on. He used the historical moment in order to get away from things. It would be like someone today wanting to break away from their family and going off to work for the Trump campaign, let's say.
Yeah.
Maybe I was a little too political there.
No. I mean, it's true. It's true. Like and as a result, he's as much a victim of history as like history uses. He may think he's using history to his own ends, but history left its mark on him as well. It's interesting that like there's a point when we're talking about the two styles. There's actually, I don't know if it's the only point, but there's a point early on when Fabio looks in the mirror, and what he sees in the mirror is actually this, the screen printed looking younger self on.
Right, yeah,
and so there is kind of this bleed. I mean, but also it makes the narrative technique very obvious yeah. So.
Right, so there you have these two moments in time. The narrative of the past, the narrative of memory, and the present narrative kind of coming together in a way that does make sense. So it doesn't surprise you in any way that it does happen. I mean, it's a little jarring, but in I think a positive way. I think another thing that Alfred does that is visually compelling when it comes to, let's say, bringing together moments of time, or you could even argue taking our main character Fabio out of time in a way. This appears toward the end of the book, and this is after they're in Italy. They've just had an accident in the car because they take on this dog passenger. What is the dog's name? I can't remember. Do they give him a name?
Yeah, I don't think they do. If they do, I don't remember either. Yeah.
Yeah, and the dog is snapping at, it looks like a mosquito, some kind of bug, and it causes the car to go off the road. They have an accident, and as they're just lying on the ground, kind of waiting to, for things to kind of calm down a bit, Fabio has this moment where he's looking up in the sky, and the clouds kind of drift, and we have 2 pages at least worth of these clouds drifting that become almost like abstract shapes that fill these panels. And then these eventually lead to the next page, which is a very different kind of art style, which is not near as tight, very sketchy, although you do have very basic colors here. And Fabio is talking to someone who ends up being this dog. And so here he's having this conversation with the dog, and this is probably the most interior that Fabio gets in the entire book. I mean, this is his going deep down into himself here, so much so that at times during this several-page conversation with the dog, the way that Fabio looks and the way that the dog looks become almost indistinguishable. It's almost as if, yeah, Fabio's talking to himself, who's represented as the dog, but then the dog becomes Fabio or vice versa. And it's this, again, kind of I know I used the word surreal in terms of Dieter Lumpen. I think this is a very surreal, definitely psychological way of getting into, I think, a major turning point in this narrative.
Yeah, and when I say that, it's very loose. It's not like Alfred doesn't know how to stage a scene. There are some standout scenes in this book, especially, I think, the two, well, you must mention the opening scene where, Giovanni finally tracks down Fabio after Fabio's just lost a boxing match. But instead of presenting those events in chronological order, this is like pretty much the first scene of the book. Alfred crosscuts them. He crosscuts the losing. He crosscuts Fabio losing, getting a pounding in this match with the confrontation of the two brothers just standing there about 10 feet away from each other, not daring to move any closer, talking at each other across this alley. It's a little obvious, but it's a very effective crosscut because it makes that meeting, it heightens the antagonism between the brothers and that meeting. The metaphor, like the metaphor is a little obvious, but I find it really works. And then the other standout scene for me is the scene in about the middle of the book, about I think in the 130s, page 130 or so, is the scene where up till now I think we've been led to think Giovanni is the better brother, the good brother, and Fabio is the wild one, but we're encouraged to explore a lot of Giovanni's contradictions too when he goes and sees the woman he ran away from,
Maria.
Yeah, and she's hanging laundry, and it's this incredible 8-page sequence with where these huge white billowy sheets are just he staged the action around them so that sometimes you can see past them they're blocking parts of characters. It's just a really nifty piece of dramatic blocking. Right. It
almost becomes something like theatrical curtains.
Yeah, it's very lyrical. Yeah. And it allows for a lot of this sort of expressive white space, and parts of characters to be cut off, dialogue to kind of float around, it's. I
agree. That was along with the scene that I mentioned previously, the one toward the end where Fabio talks to the dog. This scene with Maria hanging the laundry, the sheets, has to be one of my favorites of this book. And again, it's a story where you don't have a lot of outward action that takes place, but everything that goes on, it's either relationship related or interior action. And I think this scene with Maria is a great example of that.
Yeah, whereas the scene you're talking about, he really does go into this kind of Pfeiffer-esque
it does look like Jules Pfeiffer, yeah.
Yeah, when it was just Fabio and the dog, it's and the border, there are no more panels, panel borders, it's just, yeah.
Yeah, I really did enjoy this book, but I want to ask you, and you seem to like the story as well, but you hinted at something earlier in this episode, and that is that you weren't too pleased with the translation. Now, you've read this in the original French, correct?
Yes.
That's what you read first, and then you read this translation. So, how do the two compare?
Well, I think, I think my beef with Dieter Lumpen's translation was that I felt like it could have been moved farther away from the French, that it was always correct but just not smooth. This one actually to me does read like it's not translated by someone whose native language, it's not been run through. It's even a little worse than that. It's not been run through by someone whose native language is English, and that comes out to the most in this sort of.
Do you think this is the result of it being translated by a body instead of an individual, Studio Sharon?
Well, I don't know if it was actually translated by a body. I mean, even though they got the credit, it could just be one employee there who did it.
It could be, but I mean, but even if it's just one employee there who did it, because not the employee, but the studio was listed, this does become in some way, even in a minor way, a corporate action.
Sure, but I think the thing is it's. What strikes me about this translation is how inconsistent it is. It's like and that I think is the mark of of like I mean Dieter mostly sounded the same. It just was, in fact, one of the problems is like everyone kind of sounds the same in Dieter, which is not desirable. But in this one, it's like sometimes people are really slangy, but it's a little misplaced. It's not the right slang, or it's like it's not the right date. The slang isn't the right is anachronistic, or and other times people are oddly formal. Like I feel like this translation is a little all over the place, and which sounds like I'm saying there are too many chefs, but one person who isn't that good can make it sound like this, or trained or whatever. I think. I don't think anyone will not get the meaning out of this. I just think that it certainly doesn't sound natural at any point.
So you think that one individual could have done the translation of Come Prima, and that could have resulted in what you're experiencing?
I think it's possible. The turns of phrase that I think are.
Well, the bottom line is you enjoyed the original French better.
Oh, sure.
Much more.
Well, it was all of a piece. It felt like it did. I mean, and the original French it was studded with Italian, and it had fun touches like that. But it was I think this one is just inconsistent.
But I definitely found it a compelling story, though.
Yeah, no, and
very moving.
And the art is I think Alfred's landscapes. I think the landscapes were the first thing I fell in love with, and then I also started appreciating how he actually uses it. But the pictorial quality is really high.
Yeah. Well, I think that this is one that we could highly recommend to our listeners. Even given some of the translation issues that you pointed out.
Oh yeah, it would be a pity to miss out on it. I do think. Yeah. Yeah. And it's very cinematic. Both the books we did today were very cinematic in different ways. Yeah. No, I just wanted to add that Alfred is entirely self-taught as an artist, which is not only a testament to his diverse and incredible ability, but also kind of rare in the French scene today. France has so many well-funded fine arts academies that with comics programs, and that seems to be the normal route for artists and illustrators. And so. Yeah, definitely check this out.
And in fact, both books that we discussed for this month are worth checking out. We started off with Jorge Zentner and Rubén Pellejero's The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, another in IDW's EuroComics imprint. And then we also talked about Alfred's Come Prima, and this is part of the Delcourt ComiXology Translation Initiative. So definitely check out those books there. But you can also find great discounts on comics from our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and as Edward pointed out at the top of the show, you can find great discounts not only on The Adventures of Dieter Lumpen, but on other books in translation as well. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to get in touch with us and let us know what you think about our EuroComics series. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message from the comfort of your own computing device. It's as easy as that by clicking a button. Or you can do it the hard way by picking up the telephone and calling us at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
You can also contact us by email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly, edward@comicsalternative.com.
And you can contact me at derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. You can even listen to us now on Spotify, and if you're an Android user, on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the written reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog by going to our website, ComiXalternative.com. So, Edward, many ways for people to get in touch with us.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I hope you do.
Yeah, we'd like to hear some of your recommendations that you might have. As we mentioned earlier, Edward and I already have been thinking about books for future months' episodes. But, hey, if you have some suggestions, then chime in. And until next time, I'm Derek.
I'm Edward.
We'll see you later.
Thanks for listening.